Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with Impulse, tournament grinder extraordinaire, the Jeskai master. Welcome to the channel. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to sit down and talk with you. I built an entire deck designed to beat you and your deck. So I've never had a chance to actually sit down and chat with you in depth. So I'm excited to hear about the mind behind the Jeskai and, of course, some of your other thoughts about our wonderful, wonderful format. One of the things I like to kick us off with is sort of an introductory, get to know you a little bit more before we talk about what you did or do in Canadian Highlander. So, what got you into Magic? What led to you being the Jeskai mastermind?
Yeah. So when I was like all the way back in first grade, I loved puzzle games. Played a lot of like the banjo games and Zelda Ocarina of Time on my 64, and got really into chess club in grade school, and ended up going to a bunch of tournaments. Took like a top 10 finish
Wow,
at the state journey in sixth grade.
child prodigy
Um,
almost.
yeah, not that far. Yeah, it was only out of like a few hundred, but really enjoyed
Hmm.
chess. Really enjoyed puzzle games in general. Started my older brother, he's like 17 years older than me. So he played a lot of like WoW Classic and Blizzard games back in the day, and got me into Hearthstone, and then later Magic. And I played a lot of Hearthstone, hit Legend. I think for like almost 3 years consecutively,
Is
which
that the
is like,
highest in Hearthstone? I've not played
yeah,
much.
yeah, it's yeah. Once you hit Legend, it's when you have a numbered
Hmm.
rank, like you're like Legend 2000 or Legend
Right.
1500 or whatever. Um,
What was your highest number?
but yeah, it was I broke into top 100 in Wild.
Wow.
Um, Yeah, with a deck that I helped. It wasn't similar to what I did in this format. There was an old archetype called Miracle
Hmm.
Rogue, which is kind of equivalent to Storm in Magic, like a traditional Storm deck. It's like a lot of Lotus Petals, and then you play. There's big creatures that have affinity for the number of spells you've cast this
Hmm.
turn. And so it was a deck that had like it died off, and people weren't playing it as much, and I like re-innovated it and brought it back to life, and that was the deck that I took to top 50.
Wow.
Um,
So a
but
lot of
yeah,
Hearthstone.
uh,
How'd you end up in Magic?
yeah. So my older brother got me into it. The first deck I played was a Grand Arbiter Augustine the Fourth commander deck that we played
Hmm.
1v1 that he had built for me, which maybe that's where my love for control and love for blue spawned from.
of all
Um,
of all of the commanders to do the like blue control thing, Grand Arbiter's up there. That's a top contender.
oh yeah. So yeah, played it casually for a bit, and then ended up getting into it more competitively towards when I started college. Played both Hearthstone and MTG Arena in college on the esports team.
Hmm.
Um, that's also when I started a very brief, like 6 month career of paper grinding
Wow.
before we hit COVID-19, which kind of killed that.
Yeah.
The paper grinding
Hard to
aspect.
grind paper when there's
Uh,
no events at all being held.
exactly. So I full pivoted into MTGO grinding, which I did casually at first, and for a few months I was trying to see if I could make an income out of it. So I was triple
Hmm.
grinding, playing Pauper, Vintage, Legacy, and Modern, and sometimes triple queuing them,
That's
um,
insane.
which made some money there, but it's not healthy.
I mean, it reminds me of like the early 2000s and the mid 2000s when people were playing online poker and they'd pull up nine hands on a screen at once, and since most of your time in poker is just folding, the goal is to just play as many hands as possible because more hands means more opportunities to win money.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
also was a pretty miserable existence from what I've heard.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely the big thing. If you 5-0 a league, it's like equivalent to somewhere between like 25 and 35
Hmm.
US and your entry back. But then that league can often take like 2+
Hmm.
hours. So even if you're 5-0ing every league, that's like barely minimum wage.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get that 5-0 when you're playing against someone else that's also a
Hmm.
grinder. Because a lot of the people that you're playing into in the 4-0 bracket are either exceptional players or they're grinders. Not that those are mutually
Yeah.
exclusive, but
Well, also, I imagine
um,
if those people are only playing one queue at a time, they have a bit more focus or energy dedicated to that game than you. So you not only have to be better than them, but you have to be better than them while your attention is being distributed across three games, which is, I imagine,
yeah,
a fair
yeah.
bit tougher as well.
But yeah, so after about 6 months, I ended up retiring from that. Went to focus on my career and my family,
Mhm.
and basically retired into Canadian Highlander. Um,
That's funny. I think my Canadian Highlander is sort of where I started becoming a real grinder. I mean, I did a little bit in CDH, but Canadian Highlander is where I started my grind career. Canadian Highlander is where you're ending yours. What a wonderful way for these minds to meet. What? How did you discover Canadian Highlander? Where was the first place you heard of it?
it was through LLR.
Hmm.
Well, definitely like one of the first things that that pushed me into like exploring more in Magic when I first started. Just googling Magic and finding a Friday Nights video,
Hmm.
and then I'm sure binge watching all of them over a few days. Sorry, I lost the question.
Just where? How'd you find Canadian Highlander, and what is it that keeps you attracted to this format? I mean, you clearly have a lot of experience with all the different ways competitive Magic can exist. Why is this the one that you decided to retire into?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is the one I decided to retire into because Vintage Cube is like absolutely my favorite format. I
Yeah.
own a Vintage Cube outside of the Power and a couple of revised list
Sure.
pieces. Vintage Cube has like an issue of needing to both get like 4 to 12 people
Hmm.
together to draft it, and then the time investment of you don't actually get to play Magic for the first like hour and a half because it's a 40-minute
Hmm.
draft and then deck building. So Canlander was an aspect of that, the constructed cube aspect, which is what drew me to it. It's a very fundamentals based format. Like having a good understanding of the basics of Magic, the fundamentals of Magic will help you a lot in
Hmm.
Canlander, and that's kind of what brought me here.
I think it's interesting that for me, when I vintage cube, easily the most fun I have is the drafting part because I'm just brewing up some absolute monstrosity of a concoction. Versus in Canadian Highlander, I think what I enjoy most is the actual like playing of Canadian Highlander. When you play Canadian Highlander, do you think you prefer doing the brewing or the tuning or the piloting? Not that these are mutually exclusive aspects or traits of engaging with Magic and with Canadian Highlander.
I think that I do like a fair amount of all three. I do like to brew a lot, but that can kind of take the back seat to Jeskai, which is just my baby. And so a solid like 90% of my time goes into tuning Jeskai and piloting Jeskai to like the absolute best of my
Hmm.
ability. When I am brewing, I focus mostly on like various blue piles. So Jeskai was a big one that I kind of uh, shook the dust off of Jeskai proper a little bit. Because Jeskai Green was very popular, but traditional Jeskai wasn't. Check Shift, also a deck that I dusted off and brought into modernity a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, and then Atraxa and Taxes was a deck that Vast Symbol Man and I worked on. Which you'll see it around a little bit, especially in the Discord. It's just like Abzan Death and Taxes, but with an NO for a Traxa pile.
I actually think when very long ago was just starting to explore the format, I saw that deck and I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, but I don't know if I've seen it much since then.
Yeah. And then Bug Smog, like Chain of Smog combo is the one I'm working on currently. It's hard to be able to brew with the limited amount of time that I have compared to how much work I need to keep my Jeskai on that knife's edge. Whether that be in terms of like tuning and adapting to the various metagames or like my pilot skill on not getting rusty.
Yeah, that's one of my fears and one of my concerns when I take time away from Time Vault is like, well, I could play this other deck, or I could spend that time getting better at Time Vault. And every time I go to an event, I'm like, I look back and I go, wow, okay, I made multiple misplays during those matches, and that was why I lost. So I totally get that. What keeps you invested, engaged? You know, do you ever find yourself getting bored of Jeskai, or is it just it never stops being interesting?
Yeah, like definitely a little bit. Jeskai is a fantastic deck. But playing the same deck over and over is not for everyone. The reward is there. There's definitely a mastery curve where you just get to the point where you stop making the same mistakes. And when you stop making the same mistakes, eventually you stop making mistakes at all. And that's how you break above like 60% win rate, 65% win rate. Which is really difficult in a card that's based around RNG. Or in a card game that's based around RNG.
And especially in a format where we lean into that RNG so much with 100 cards in single
play. Yeah, which is another reason why I love Jeskai, is because a big aspect of how to play card games and be successful in card games is to either like lean into the RNG and just go, I'm going to try to high roll opponents, or you try to lean away from the RNG and go, how can I prevent myself from the RNG having a high effect on my draws, my deck, my game plan. And that's why I love Jeskai. It does an incredible job of leaning away from the RNG and just having a consistent approach to every game, consistent approach to most matchups.
For all of our listeners or people who are tuning in, we're going to probably be talking about Jeskai for a fair bit here. So I'm going to throw a link to the deck list that we're discussing in the description. If I can. I think there was some YouTube rule that stopped me the last time I tried that, but I'm going to plan to put it there, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. If not, look up the Jeskai Solution on Moxfield. But yeah, we're going to be talking about Jeskai for a little bit because this is a pretty monster of a deck. One of the things I recall when I first started looking at it, I mean, you're playing basically every reasonable cantrip and basically every reasonable 2-mana spell. Has that always been the case for this deck, or is that something that you sort of added in as you tuned and refined it?
No, not at all. If you when you look up Jeskai, you'll be able to see all the past versions of it on my Moxfield profile. I've bookmarked them every couple months or so. So I originally joined the server. It was for the second or third time, but playing consistently, joined the server in October 2022. I started playing in the webcam weeklies and went on a tear. I won, I think it was 16 out of 17 weeklies in a row.
Jesus Christ.
or 16 out of 18. There was one that I had to miss just due to life stuff, and then the other stuff I tried a very odd tinker brew that did not succeed, and I went 1-2. But the other, all my wins were with a variety of decks too. I played Blue Moon, I played traditional Blue White, I played Rug Tempo, I played Storm, I played Thoracle. I was just trying a bunch of different decks and got very lucky with good RNG to be able to succeed with them. I don't think that that's something that would ever be possible to mimic. It was such a crazy streak.
Well, that's what everybody always says until another streak happens, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that was enough to qualify me for the 2022 Discord year end in like a little over 3 months of playing, which was pretty crazy.
So no, go ahead.
That's when I started Jeskai, was February 2023. I couldn't decide what deck I wanted to bring. I knew it was time for me to pick a deck and master it. And I was worried about Price of Progress and Blood Moon, which were pretty major factors on the metagame at that point. Between Monsters, Red, White, Blue Moon, these are all decks that could run Blood Moon and they could run Price of Progress. And so I decided to lean away from Jeskai Green, which is a deck that I had success with and a lot of people were having success with at that point. Cut the color and go back to a more basic and proactive game plan. That Jeskai deck looked a lot different, than the Jeskai deck I'm playing now.
What are the most key differences between the Jeskai of early 2023 and the Jeskai of, or I guess mid 2020, early to mid 2023, and then the Jeskai of early to mid 2024? Outside of course, the addition of some of the cards that have been printed in that interim. Did I lose you?
Oh, hello.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah, so there are 32 differences between my current list and the Jeskai list I brought then. The Jeskai list I brought to the 2022 Invitational was a very proactive shell. I played Double Mox, True Name, Mana Drain, and then Double Delve. A lot of cards like Lelia, Thalia, Archon, even Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It was Aven Mind Sensor too. It was a lot more proactive. So I was looking to get on the board fast and then use my interaction to close the game out. A lot more of a tempo game plan. And it ended up getting there.
So you won the Invitational?
Yeah,
nice.
I went undefeated through all of it.
Wow. So it worked.
There's also it's pinned in the Jeskai channel on the server. But there was a specific game against Symbol Man, the Winota pilot at the time, where he Blood Mooned me, and I had a Comet in hand, and I top decked 1 out of like 90 basic planes.
Wow.
Played Comet and rolled 6, 6, 6, 5, 5, 1, 1.
Wow.
And so domed him for 16, cracked in for 2, which put him down to 2 or 1, and then won the turn after,
Wow.
which closed out that set. Pretty crazy. That was just after Comet had come out too, so it was quite a shock to be able to see the card high roll like that.
Yeah, Comet definitely has a very swingy outcome on the game, one way or the other. When did you?
So yeah,
go ahead.
After that, I realized that Moxen were like nowhere close to Ancestor
That's my next
Recall.
question. That's what I was about to ask.
Yeah, nowhere close to Ancestral Recall. And so I swapped over to Recall. You also saw Loa get pointed down, which pushed me a lot more towards Control. At this point, I still wasn't running all of the cantrips and one drop interaction that I am now. The list was still fairly clunky. I cut some of the proactive cards, but I was still on like Fable and Fall from Favor and Palace Jailer. Yeah, fast forward to a few months after that, I started to trim those cards, get lower to the ground, started to cut a lot of the 4 and 5 drops. And then that trend has just continued until I am where I am now, which is I'm very strongly of the opinion that the backbone of Jeskai is having consistent access to the removal spells and to the counter spells when you need them, which is typically early into the game. And so I'm running the maximum amount that I can cram in of those effects, the cheap interaction, as well as the cantrips to be able to consistently find the ones I need. So going as deep as like Serum Visions and Sleight of Hand and Impulse, going for removal as deep as like Strangle, and then for counter spells stuff like Memory Lapse and Veto. Also my curve, the way I have it sorted on my Mox field, I think is true to what it is. Most of the cards in my deck that are 4 or 5 or 6 mana aren't actually 4 or 5 or 6 mana.
Yeah, you never cast them at that mana value.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can, but stuff like Fury and like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria is a practical 3-drop in a lot of matchups. Like Lorien has island cycling, etc., etc.
What do you think is it about Jeskai that made it so successful at the year end? But what is more interesting to me is also what has made it so successful since then. Why is this deck so dominant and so powerful? And obviously, to some extent, you're going to do well on any deck that you play. But I think Jeskai is broadly successful, even far beyond you piloting it in any specific meta or in any specific event.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeskai Green is the more popular variant, but the Jeskai Green players are great, and I think any of them could have a level of success on Jeskai close to what they have on Jeskai Green. The decks, even though they have different names and they're a little bit different, are incredibly similar. Violet Eventide, she's one of my closest like co-brewers. We work on Jeskai and talk about it a lot. She's on Jeskai Green. I'm on Jeskai. Our lists are, I think it's like 12 cards different.
And a couple of those are lands.
And yeah, I think 5 or 6 of those are lands. Our spell choices are only the splash cards, and that's it. I've stuck with Jeskai this long because I really think that the deck is the Delver deck of this format. So in Legacy, Delver has a high play rate because of its matchup spread. There's other factors, obviously. But the matchup spread is a really key thing because Delver doesn't have a lot of exceptionally bad matchups. And I think Jeskai is super similar. I would describe Jeskai as having like a matchup spread where the majority, a very strong majority, 99% of its matchups fall within like 40 to 65%. And a lot of those matchups fall within that 50 to 55%. The deck is consistent. It's Brainstorm, it's Swords to Plowshares, it's Lightning Bolt, and it's hard to go wrong when you're including those cards in your deck. They're widely applicable cards. They work in a lot of matchups. You're on Counterspell, you're on Force of Will, and there's not a lot of decks that can dodge that interaction.
What do you think are the decks that Jeskai has the best matchup against? What are the ones when you sit down to plan an event? What decks are you most happy to be sitting down against?
Jeskai fares really well into um, any deck that is heavily reliant on its creatures.
Hmm.
So that could be a deck like Craterhoof. I think that matchup is like 75% Jeskai flavored. You just kill everything. um, Delver or like tempo shells would be another example. Like they try to put pressure on you, you just kill their stuff. You stabilize at 15, and then they're just playing a much worse version of your deck with much lower card quality, and you grind the game out from there. Those are like the absolute best matchups. After that, you start to fall into a middle category with like slightly flavored matchups, which can be a lot of the mid range decks, blue or otherwise. Once again, Jeskai just has hyper efficient removal that's paired with good card quality.
What are the decks that you're most scared of? If somebody's gonna plan to beat you, what are they gonna be sleeving up to do that?
It's really, really hard to beat Jeskai.
Yeah, I know.
Similar to Delver in Legacy, Delver can beat virtually any deck in the format if it is prepared for that deck. And I think that statement extends to Jeskai. Is the best deck to bring to an event to beat Jeskai is a deck that Jeskai isn't prepared for. Which that's like a little bit of a cop out, and I'll go into more of a real answer. But even stuff like, for example, last summer we saw Flash Hulk meta. Jeskai just started to tech for Flash Hulk. So we saw Jeskai was, I was running Containment Priest, I was running Subtract, or it's a 1 mana blue spell that lets you name a card and search your opponent's library
Extract.
for that card, and Extract, thank you.
I've played that in food chain decks.
Old Blue Moon tech from this format, and then Legacy food chain tech, like you mentioned. But stuff like that.
Food chain tech too. All right, it's a real format, I swear.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, you were saying.
No, yeah, but running tech like that. We saw the initiative meta, and we saw Jeskai tech for that. That was where my list first had a lot of success, was during the initiative meta. With running flash flyers. Like your opponent goes turn 2, or turn 3. They jam their Seasoned Dungeoneer, and you go, okay, you have the initiative. End of turn, I'll go Vendilion Click. I'll take the best card from your hand. I'll untap. I'll Flame Slash your Dungeoneer. Now it's an empty board, and then I'll swing and take the initiative.
It seems pretty backbreaking.
And yeah, incredibly backbreaking, and it was a very, very consistent play pattern. So, and then now we're kind of seeing, through a lot of down points, we're seeing artifact decks on the rise. And once again, it's on paper an absolutely horrendous matchup for Jeskai. But then Jeskai can just include some tech for it, some like Brotherhood's End, a Braid, Tidebinder, March of Otherworldly Light, Dress Down, stuff like that. Just a few slots. And those backbreaking effects for the Time Vault deck or for the Paradox Academy deck brings the matchup back to a 50-50, or somewhere around there.
It makes perfect sense in that the control deck does its best when it gets to play control, and not its best when it has to play control against a deck it's not prepared to control or contain. Especially in a format where we don't have access to 4-ofs, where we don't have access to sideboards. When you look at other singleton formats like, Australian Highlander, they can put all the tech they need for any matchup into their sideboard. We don't have the luxury of doing so. We have to read the meta before we actually show up to the event. Is that a skill that you feel you've got a pretty good sense? I mean, if you're playing Jeskai, you kind of have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. But is that something you have put thought into or practiced in anticipating what the meta is going to be for a given event?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I try to get a read on metas before they happen, as much as they can. I have a couple dozen of the best brewers that I stock their mox fields a lot. Just to see what's going on and what's getting worked on, what directions the format could head. I like to talk to a couple of the counselors a lot too, and discuss like future points changes, stuff like
Hmm.
that, where they see the format going, because they also have a good beat on the format. Um,
That's pretty sweet. I mean, I've never thought to go like stalk people's mox fields to get a sense of the meta. I'm just like, I want to play my stupid artifact decks. I don't give a shit. I'm just gonna show with what I got. But it makes sense that if you're gonna have to play if you're gonna play a deck that reads the meta, you're gonna have to spend the time to read the meta. So
but yeah, and reading the meta kind of brings me back to a more solid answer to your last question, which is like, what decks would you bring to beat Jeskai at an event? And I think the best thing you can do to beat Jeskai is to bring a deck that has an otherwise good matchup spread outside of Jeskai, and then has either an even or slightly favored matchup against Jeskai. Where we are currently in the meta, Jeskai, Jeskai Green, check, and various blue mid-range piles are like really popular.
hmm
So I would never bring a deck that doesn't have a solid game plan for those matchups.
hmm
There's a lot of ways to do that, and we can talk about that later in the meta section. But stuff like Gruul Monsters, very proactive, has a consistent matchup spread, and is decent into Jeskai. Time Vault, same thing. It can be like a blisteringly fast combo. It can play a reactive game, so it has a lot of good matchups, and then it has an even or slightly favored Jeskai matchup. So I think looking for decks like those is going to be the key to winning tournaments over the next few months.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that some of I mean, those three decks the three decks right there, Jeskai, Gruul Monsters, and Time Vault, I think exist as some of the standout decks right now, and I don't know if they'll be that'll I don't know if any of that'll still be true in 3 months from now, but they're definitely decks that I see doing well, and decks each every time I play against any of those three, I definitely feel some of the greatest amounts of fear versus some of the other decks in the format. But I do think that of all the decks, Jeskai is the most consistent, and its consistency is what makes it most consistently a threat. Do you think Jeskai is the best deck in the format, and do you think it's a good thing for Jeskai to be the best deck in the format? If you think it is,
Um, I it's hard to quantify like the best deck
mm-hmm.
in the format. Um, there are a lot of players and a lot of different metas. But I do think that it's pretty safe to say that Jeskai has been the best deck. If you asked me this a year ago, I would have said that Jeskai is absolutely the best deck in the format. Jeskai Green was the top dog in the format. From like around the start of COVID, when we got Uro and Omnath and Oko originally, till when we saw Jeskai get hit by several pointings. We saw Ancestral grow up. We saw Fourth Earlingus go
Mm-hmm.
up. And then we saw some odd 20 cards go down over the course of a year for various other decks. And Jeskai is a reactive deck. So the more unhealthy the meta is, the better Jeskai is going to be. Because if a deck like Flash Hulk is so incredibly underpointed that it's the best deck in the format, that makes Jeskai even better because you know what you're going against. You know that you're going to need to beat Flash Hulk, and you can prep for that.
Do you think that there
Um,
is a significant amount of thought that goes into how your deck is going to play in Swiss versus how your deck is going to play in top eight? Is that something that you think about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have the Jeskai group chat. There's 10 of us, various Jeskai and Jeskai Green pilots. And we really focus on like working together and honing the deck and preparing it. But there's definitely a big difference between preparing for a wide open meta and needing to go 4-0 in pools versus playing for a much more closed meta. Um, which is why my technique in the last couple asyncs has been to play Jeskai in pools because of its consistent matchup spread, and then to bring a more honed in pick for top 8. Last month I brought like Demir Turbo Reanimator,
Sure.
and took down the async with that because I expected a lot of blue.
Did it work? I don't know. I don't keep tabs.
Yeah, I got there.
Nice.
Yeah. No, yeah, I played into Jeskai, Green, and then Winota, and then RDW in the finals.
Nice. Very cool.
So it wasn't as blue as I had predicted and prepped my deck for, being on stuff like Dispel and Flusterstorm even.
Well, that's one of the things I learned this last weekend. I was down in San Francisco, and it was easily my worst tournament result since I started playing. And it was because my deck is designed to beat blue, which is very, very common in the Pacific Northwest, especially the Pacific Northwest paper tournaments. There's lots of people who enjoy their recalls, and I didn't play against the only deck with blue in it that I played against was Flash Hulk, which is like a blue deck, but is also not quite the same. And so my deck's designed to beat mid-range blue, and I saw no mid-range blue and just died to a bunch of clutch roofs. So I think that the ability to read the meta is really important, even when you're not playing a deck that solely relies, or not solely relies, but is one of the greatest amounts of skill expression for the deck is being prepared for a meta going into it. So, what decks do you think, when we're thinking about the meta, what decks do you think there are, overplayed or overrepresented? I know that and we'll get to decks you think are underrepresented or that need to be played more, but is there something that too many people are sleeving up? I know Gruul Monsters tends to have a pretty high representation because it's recommended often to players who are new. Do you think that's a problem?
So for me, when I mentioned the big three in the current metagame as Jeskai, Time Vault, and Gruul Monsters, it's not those three specific decks. There's a few more under categories. So for Jeskai, it's not just the red, white, blue combination. It could also be Jeskai Green. It could be Jeskai Black. It could be Bug. It could be Grixis. It could be Rug. But it's just that like blue mid-range pile. And a lot of them have different strengths and weaknesses. Same thing with Time Vault. There's Time Vault, and then there's like the non-combo welder variants, and then there's like more traditional Paradox Academy. I think that like all those decks are good to their own right, but I think Time Vault is the one that's on top. And it's the same thing with Gruul Monsters. Gruul Monsters, when I mention it, when considering metagame, I talk about Gruul Monsters as a soul mana aggro deck. And I think that soul mana is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Whether that be green white monsters or green black monsters or green red monsters or even red white death and taxes. So it's a much broader category. So I think to answer the question, I think the thing that is most overrepresented, and I would encourage players to stop investing so much in, is playing the mid-range piles that are like 3 or 4 colors that don't play either soul mana or blue. I think that if you're not playing soul mana or you're not playing blue in your mid-range pile, you're missing out on a lot, and I think that you should move in a direction towards where you're playing one or the other.
What types of decks? I don't know if any of those come to mind. What do you like? Are there specific decks you're thinking of or referring to?
On the Discord, there's like a fair amount of Abzan and Jund
Mhm.
piles, um, like triple Mox piles. And like it's a fun deck and it's a cool area to explore, but it's not something that impresses me. I strongly encourage players to either abuse fast mana or abuse blue and abuse the cantrips.
So one of the questions that I had here was, what do you think traps players into bad play patterns or bad strategies? Why do you think people are pulled towards these types of decks if you don't think they're very strong?
They're a lot of fun. You gotta
Yeah.
have, yeah, you gotta have a lot of customizability, because you're not locked into a niche of you need to play 30 blue cantrips and counterspells, and you're not locked into a niche of all my cards need to have 2 generic mana so I can cast them off city
Hmm.
traders. So you get to see a lot more, like random draft cards. Um, which is a lot of fun. And if players are playing for fun, then that's like absolutely an upside.
Hmm.
But from a purely competitive angle, I don't like them at all.
Do you think that that's a problem in terms of the points list? That soul mana decks and blue piles feel like the correct places to be for mid range or for aggro? Is it a problem that triple mox spreads don't feel particularly compelling?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at other Eternal formats, they are all also built off of that presence, excuse me, built off of that precedent.
Hmm.
Like if we look at vintage, all of the piles are either blue or they play Ancient Tomb.
Sure.
As far
That's
as as
yeah.
far as mid range like fair piles, and that does extend to Legacy as well, somewhat. Um,
Do you think that when people come into this format from other places, that the decks they choose are based off of what they played in those formats?
Somewhat. I think that players can also do full 180s. There's a lot of interesting things in this format, and I think this format especially is one where players are more likely to explore something that's outside of their wheelhouse.
Hmm.
Um,
What do
I wanted to mention another trap that I feel like players fall into that I think is worth mentioning
mhm.
is an idea that they need to answer everything or prep for everything.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like I see it a lot. Like people talking about Blood Moon and Price of Progress. And like whether they should cut like good mana base pieces from their deck to prep for those. Or another example would be there was a Flash Hulk player long ago in the Flash Hulk chat that was talking about losing to Containment Priest and wanted to go up like 4 or 5 removal spells to be able to more consistently deal with Containment Priest.
Hmm.
When it's like you don't have to deal with everything. Sometimes your opponent has it. Um, and that's fine. You just need to make it so that your deck isn't consistent, or your deck is consistent when your opponent doesn't have it,
Hmm.
and that's a lot more important.
The ability to exploit when your opponent stumbles is a trait that I value very highly with Time Vault, because so often if my opponent taps out, I'll just kill them. That it makes it so players can never feel like they can tap out. It creates very like intriguing play patterns, um, and sort of punishes that type of thing you're describing, where like if your deck stumbles at all, you can't beat everything, but the moment your opponent doesn't have it, you do. I think that's a trait that is common among decks that are very strong.
You can see that in like all three of what we described as the top of the meta.
Hmm.
Jeskai, Gruul Monsters, and Time Vault. If your opponent misses a land drop, or they put the wrong removal spell to the bottom on their mill to 6,
Hmm.
or they make any tiny mistake, these decks will take that and turn it into the game from just the tiniest of mistakes.
I definitely feel like Canadian Highlander is a format played on the margins more so than most other formats because you have so much inconsistency that you can't build as strong of frameworks, I think, in comparison to 60 card formats where you're like, I know more reliably what my deck will do, whereas in Canadian Highlander, you're only going to resolve Brainstorm once on average in a game, at most. And so that
Yeah.
Brainstorm becomes much more impactful than one of your 3 Brainstorms that you resolve in a game of Legacy.
Hmm.
What types of decks attract strong players to Canadian Highlander?
I think when strong players come to the format, they obviously they're coming in competitively, so they want to win tournaments. And so sometimes that can be a meta call, like playing a proactive deck. A lot of the times you'll see the more competitive players try to lean into player agency as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and play the decks where they get to control the game state, and or make more decisions throughout the game, which blue in general does an incredible job of doing,
Yeah.
because every cantrip you use, every fetch land you use, is a micro decision. And if you make like a couple mistakes, like one mistake, whatever. If you make 2 or 3 mistakes, that like really adds up and will put you behind. Mistakes as far as, bottoming the wrong card off of a Serum Visions, or fetching at the wrong time, or not holding that land, and then you draw Brainstorm the next turn.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll see the more competitive players lean into decks like Jeskai and like Time Vault, because they provide the maximum player agency.
I think that as the format continues to grow, because we are growing at a pretty rapid rate, it's going to be interesting to see what new players decide to pick up and how new metas begin to form, right? Even a year ago, the size of weeklies in places was much smaller than it is now. And there's the one that I'm playing in, the Portland weeklies. Those are somewhere between 16 and 20 players every week, which is one of the larger weeklies that I'm aware of, in terms of at least consistently pulling a lot of players. And so it's going to be interesting, I think, to see all these different metas pop up, and then every once in a while, when all of these metas collide, what group of people, what meta game was brewing at the highest level, because all of these groups combine and somebody's going to come out on top. So I think big tournaments are an interesting way to watch these metas that are so somewhat segmented and isolated come together in a way that can only really happen in a format this size.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something I was gonna mention, because this could never happen in a format like Pioneer, where there's like net decking,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like all the different metas wouldn't be isolated, like they are in Canlander.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also why I really, really appreciate Cyclops for putting together and managing the Winners Archive.
Yeah.
It's an absolutely incredible resource, both for veteran players, to be able to see what's working in various metas, but then also for new players, to be able to see fantastic lists, that have won events that they can look at or brew with.
It's really useful up until the point where there's a wall, and I mean an absolute sea of comets. That section's less useful. If you scroll back far enough, just
Oh,
all
yes. I thought.
Jeskai.
Oh, yeah.
What types of decks do you think players need to be spending more time working on? Are there things that you don't have infinite time to brew on, but you want to see other people keep working on and keep tuning and take to a higher level?
It's mostly the ones that I mentioned as the decks that I brewed earlier in the video.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, like, just play blue, play blue, play the cantrips. They're broken. Have you read Ponder? Have you read Brainstorm? Those cards are 0 points.
Brainstorm to
Play
one
blue. And that can be blue reactive decks or blue decks that are combo with various win cons. And like that's why I've really been exploring the unpointed win conditions. Because even though they have downsides compared to the 7-point win conditions, you get to play other pointed cards in your deck. So Chain of Smog combo and Bug Smog and Check Shift are both like really prime examples of that because they have a lot of power on Time Vault or on Thoracle because they don't have to pay any points for their combo. Witherbloom, Apprentice, Chain of Smog is 0 points, and Scape Shift, Valakut, Field of the Dead are both 0 points.
Have you seen? Go ahead.
You gotta spend all those points on tutors. You gotta play DT, you gotta play Vamp, you gotta play Tainted Pact, depending on the list. And those combos are definitely not as clean as the pointed win conditions. Scape Shift requires you to have 7 lands, and it requires you to have Valakut and a bunch of mountains in your deck, which is a decent deck building cost for a deck that's primarily Dimir. And then Chain of Smog combo requires like neither of the cards are necessarily bad, but they're both below rate.
Yeah, neither are particularly good.
Yeah, they're not cards you're like super excited to cast. And then the combo itself requires you to hellbend yourself, so you can't protect it with your blue interaction. So they're both weaker in that regard, but much stronger because of the consistency that you see them and the other due to the pointed tutors that you're allowed to run.
Right. Have you seen the Teamer Time Shift, which is a Time Walk Scape Shift deck that sees a decent amount of play and a decent amount of success?
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Hyun is a good buddy of mine, and he's been working on that list for quite a while since he dropped Seeker Walk. So that's like 7 months ago. So it was really cool to see him. He recently took down a first place finish with the deck.
Do you know who he beat in the finals?
No, I wasn't aware.
Yeah, it was me. He beat me in the finals.
Okay.
No, I played against him at MXP Tacoma, and then I played against him again at with a Wizards Keep event, and then again at Cosmic Games. So I've seen him a number of times, and
he was on Seeker Walk at Tacoma, right?
Yeah, but I was also on Paradox Academy at that stage, so I don't count that as a real match between us. But our games are always so tight and so close. I'm very scared of the deck because it does go bigger than Time Vault, so I can't necessarily play the slow game. I kind of feel like I have a little bit of pressure to play time because eventually the insanity that is there's a 5-mana one that manifests every turn. Like I'll die to that. It's pretty tough to
beat. Primordial Mists, I believe.
Yeah, exactly.
The deck list is silly to look at for Teamer Time Shift as well. And that it looks really clunky, but it really speaks to the power of, because you have a combo in your deck, you can, like, to some extent, not have to interact at every stage of the game and be able to, in some regard, ignore what your opponent is doing.
Yep.
Because as long as you're pushing to your win condition and you hit it first, like, it doesn't matter if they've chipped you for 12 with a Goblin Guide.
Yep. There's definitely that, like, you can just chill. As long as your opponent isn't killing you, you don't care. You still have your life total is a resource, and using it to buy time is a valuable thing unto itself.
Yeah, and TV has that like Paradox as well.
Yeah, the combo deck, I mean Flash, right? They're not playing blockers. So, is there anything else that you want to chime in about the metagame before we move on to some format philosophy, which is one of my favorite things to talk about in these little interviews?
I don't think so. I think that's all of it.
Well, then let's talk about some format philosophy. Question 1: How's Canadian Highlander to play right now? What are your thoughts? We having a good time? Is this a good format? We in a healthy spot?
I think currently, we're seeing a couple things that are a bit underpointed. But the council is discussing a few of them currently, which is really good to hear. Um,
What
I think
what are those
as
things?
as we talked about, Soul Mana is incredibly powerful as a freebie.
Hmm.
When I see Ancient Tomb, it's a card that with being Jeskai build, um, it just seems like a card that is odd to be at 0 points. Um,
Card's nuts.
yeah, it's incredibly strong, whether it be in proactive creature decks that are using it to play Questing Beast, or the artifact decks that are using it to play a Signet on one,
Hmm.
um, or a talisman, as it were.
Right.
So Ancient Tomb is a big one. They have given artifact decks so many points. Um,
We needed it.
no, and I understand that. Uh, I understand that. It's just crazy. We got like crop rotation went down, transmute artifact went down, mind twist went down.
I don't think Mind
Um,
Twist is an artifact card.
Perhaps not. Um,
I'll yield. We didn't need transmute to zero, but I certainly
I
helped. It certainly helped.
I think that artifacts are incredibly powerful and that they deserve a spot in the metagame. I would want to see a shift um, in the way that the current points are organized
How so?
for the deck. Um, I think once again, like Urza's Saga is like often the single most powerful, or easily among the top five in most of the artifact shells.
Hmm.
Card's really strong. It's a free tutor. It creates uninteractable bodies. And I think it has like every marking of a card that like is pointable.
Hmm.
I think a 0 mana tutor that's like hard to interact with is like certainly a card that's pointable. Which isn't to say that I think that artifact decks deserve a direct nerf by Urza Saga being pointed. I think that they're at a good spot right now. I think it just took the meta catching up to them, and the dominance that they have a little bit. But now we're starting to see more people finally sleeving up Brotherhood's End, and a little bit more oofs hitting deck lists.
Yeah, I think it's because artifact decks are some of the decks that are the easiest to tech for. It's the kind of thing where artifact decks will ebb and flow in and out of style based off of whether or not people are playing what they need to play to deal with them. And you can have a metagame that is extremely hostile to artifact decks that prevents them from ever really getting a foothold. And that's what I experienced
Mm.
down in San Francisco. Like, yeah, I'll just keep losing to Clutcher because everybody put it in their deck because that's just what people tend to do, at least in that region, or at least the people that I played against.
I think that unlike some other formats, I think artifact decks in our format are easier to tech for than graveyard decks,
Mm.
which is maybe a bit of a hot take. But I think a lot of the cards that you would include for artifact matchups are a lot better in a wide spread of matchups
I
than
agree.
the cards that you would include for graveyard.
Yeah, Brotherhood Zen is just a playable card. Like a braid,
Yeah.
like it's slightly underrated, or slightly overrated, and the same with a braid. Like a braid is slightly overrated, but like it's not an unplayable Magic card.
No, yeah, absolutely. Which I think is a really big like point about, especially the cards Jeskai runs
Hmm.
to combat Time Vault. They're all cards that are good in other matchups. You can dress down a Seasoned Dungeoneer.
Yep.
You can march like a Soul Ring or any number of the other like fast mana points that come out of other decks. Brotherhood's End hits D&T like just as hard as it hits Time Vault.
Hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. So we've got Ancient Tomb, we've got Urza Saga. Anything else? Any other cards you
Well,
think?
the big thing I've been pushing to Sorensen is that I want to see Seeker Walk get buffed. Um, I whether that be like Seeker to 1 or Time Walk to 6. I think that Seeker is a really good flagship deck for the format. Um, it's a fair deck. It has a lot of redundancy, and it has a very cool and intricate combo that we just don't see in other formats.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a few people that are playing Seeker Ephemerate in Legacy, but it's very definitely a fringe deck.
Yeah, the Seeker
There,
Walk combo, or it's not the Spell Seeker combo in CEDH is all about ephemerating for Final Fortune and spell seeking for um, Enlightened Tutor to get an Underworld Breach, which is not
mm,
the same thing at all as as it is in Canadian Highlander. It's a very Canadian Highlander deck. So I hear what you're saying. I think it's a very cool deck to have as a one of the like front childs, or I guess the poster child of a deck that's very unique to Canadian Highlander.
yeah, exactly. And I would love for Seeker Walk to be in a format where someone comes in from Commander, because that's where a lot of our players come from,
Mm-hmm.
and they are looking to play something that is um, more similar to a Commander deck, and I think Seeker Walk fits that bill. In like a weird way, but like as far as game plan, it's I'm gonna value and I'm gonna combo, which is like a lot of what we see in like EDH.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to a deck like Jeskai or RDW, which are just like entirely foreign concepts to Commander.
Yeah,
As far as playing for board control or playing to aggro your opponents out, like those aren't common in Commander.
yeah, I definitely think both of those. I mean, the strategies that you have in a Jeskai deck are different than the strategies that are played in Commander. Like the Xerox style game plan is a legacy and vintage cornerstone. It's not what happened in a game of Commander. So
Mm. So yeah, Seeker Walk is another one. What else did I say? I'll need to look at my message history if we can cut this out.
mm-hmm.
That aren't very popular, being Flash Hulk, and like traditional Breach or traditional Storm. Um, Neither of those deck lists see a lot of play. I can't say I've seen either of them in at least 3 months. Um, and I think both of them could use the nudge.
Do you think that it? I mean, I think it's pretty clear the Canadian Highlander Council has a lot of reservations about downpointing combo decks. Do you think that's wise?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think that the player base in general, and myself certainly included, loves seeing combo exist in the format at that like 15 to 20%, 25%
Mm-hmm.
play rate. I think when combo gets downpointed and we start to see a lot of combo, the game becomes less fun. I'm very fair magic pilled,
Sure.
which isn't to say that I don't enjoy playing the combo matches too. It's just I don't like going to an event and playing into 4 combo decks in a row. Like that is torture. Because it's none of it's real, like air quotes, real magic, real fair magic, I suppose. And some combo decks are better about that than others. Like Time Vault is a great example of a deck that is a combo deck, but isn't a glass cannon combo deck.
Mm-hmm.
I think glass cannon combo decks are specifically the ones that I have, and the player base in general have a bit more distaste for. Because it's just I put flash on the stack. Can you stop me? If yes, I lose. If no, I win.
I think it's very funny that you specifically listed Merchant Scroll and Yawgmoth's Will, cards that are basically only played in glass cannon style combo decks.
Yeah, I think it's a balance though.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that those decks can't exist. It's just that like playing them into them every round is not the funnest.
Sure.
And that definitely extends to a deck like Jeskai. Playing into Jeskai every round is a slog, and it becomes boring. Playing into Death and Taxes and RDW every round becomes a slog, and it becomes boring. So creating balance and creating format diversity is key, and that's why I think we're in like a healthy format right now. There's a lot of different archetypes that are not just like operating, but they're operating at like a capacity where they can win events. They're flourishing.
Yeah, totally. Do you think that there's anything that the council is missing or not seeing? Do you have any disagreements with anything the council is sort of pushing towards or moving towards? Are there things you sort of wish they were doing that they're not, outside of some of the stuff you've already mentioned?
Yeah, so I mentioned the things that I want to see. The big thing that both there's a couple council members that are pushing for this, as well as like a lot of members of the community. But that is fair pointings. And I think it's time we talked about that.
You want to talk about some fair pointings?
Oh yeah. I think the big two are Minsk and Boo and White Plume Adventure. I think people mention those a lot in wanting to see them increase to 1.
Minsk and Boo definitely is a card that I am full steam ahead. I think that card is so worth a point. Card is ridiculous. White Plume I'm curious about because I've gone back and forth on it. Why do you think White Plume should be a point?
White Plume was on the agenda for the last council meeting and is on the agenda for the next one. As something that they will talk about, which is not, like in no way to say that it will be pointed or that it won't be pointed. It's just something that they're going to discuss. They discuss like a lot of cards consistently. That's the reason that I mentioned it, is because it was on the last one and it's on the next one.
Do you think it should be a point?
I don't think that Minsk and Boo or White Plume should be a point at the current spot where we are in the format. I think that, so for a fair card to be worth a point, it has to prove itself to be so ridiculously overrated that it's not fair. And we can look at a couple examples of that with the blue cards. So there's 4 blue cards on the points list that are fair cards. Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, Mana Drain, and True Name Nemesis. All these cards are fair, but they do so at like such like above rate that it's led them to being a point. So like just a spell that like, you know, draws 3, it's like that's not an issue, except when that spell costs like 1 or 2 mana. Like we can look at Ancestral Recall, which is obviously like strictly better than Cruise.
Yeah, by a little
an
bit.
8-point card. That's an 8-point card. And Cruise is like printed worse than that, but a lot of times in gameplay, it's the same thing. It's I cast it for 1 mana, I draw 3. And I think Cruise is like one of the most powerful blue point, like 1-pointers because of that. So it's such an above rate fair card that it becomes unfair. We can look at the same thing with Drain. It's like strictly better counterspell, but it adds mana. It's unfair. True Name Nemesis, once again, is a card that it's just a 3 mana 3/1, but because it's impervious to your opponent's removal, and it invalidates whole strategies on the back, like on the defense. Like it's so above rate that it deserves that point. I don't think a card like White Plume hits that point all. I do not think it is even close to being worth a point. Minsk and Boo, on the other hand, is above rate for other 4-drops. There's no other 4-drop that can do what Minsk and Boo can in all of the situations that Minsk and Boo can do what it does. Whether that's killing the opponent, whether that's drawing a lot of cards. I don't think we're at a point where Minsk and Boo is so above rate in difference to the other 4-drops that it deserves a point before we start to look at some of the other changes that we can make in the format.
What are those other changes?
The ones that I just mentioned. I'd love to see a few of those changes, and then see how the meta adapts from there. I don't think, I think everyone can agree that Minsk and Boo is above rate compared to other 4-drops, and that if there were a fair card to be pointed, it would probably be Minsk and Boo. I think where people disagree is whether the difference is high enough to where Minsk and Boo deserves that point.
Sure. That makes sense.
And there's two very divided camps on this.
That makes sense. What do you think is, we talked a little bit about the things you might disagree with. What are the things that you think are going really well right now that, some examples of really good pointings, things that make a lot of sense that really you agree with? Do you agree with the changes that all came out through the last cycle? Recall to 8, 4th to 1, the ones most obviously impacting you, and then some of the other stuff that they've downpointed.
Looking back at the last couple points changes, I like all of the changes.
Mm-hmm.
I think Recall was so above and away of the other 7-point cards, and then above and away as a point spread for Blue.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you ever choose 2 Moxes +1 when you could choose Recall?
Sure.
That I think Recall deserved 8. I think at 8 there's a little bit more of an argument, but I really want to see Walk go down. Walk has obviously a lower floor than Recall, but it has a much higher ceiling where Time Vault can literally just win you the game.
Mm-hmm.
If you're ahead on board. So I'd love to see Recall or Walk to 6 as a competition to Recall. In the last point change, we saw a couple of the creature deck pieces go down with Birthing Pod and Natural Order. That's totally fine. DT to 3, which is totally fine. Strip going down, which I like a lot because it competes against the mid-range supification of the format. Seeing a lot of splashes where there don't need to be 4 and 5 color nonsense piles. And I think having less of those is always good. Yeah, and I think 4th was absolutely a fair card that we just talked about the fair cards and how they have to break above that level to be worth a point, and I think 4th hit that. 4th was auto include in every deck that could produce more than 5 mana.
Pretty much, yeah.
Any deck that could consistently produce 3 generic red-white would play 4th. Whether that was Academy decks, whether that was red-white aggro, whether it was Jeskai, it was everywhere.
Turns out,
and so
card good.
Yeah.
I think that pretty much wraps most of the questions that I had for you. Do you have anything else you sort of want to speak on? Any questions for me?
I didn't prep for this at all.
That's quite all right. Well,
I don't think I have anything for you, no.
No, very, very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and chat about some different things. I appreciate your insight into Jeskai, into metagaming, and some insight into, I guess, what the council's talking about. Things that some of the rest of us don't. So it's cool to get some extra insight in there. Some of the counselors can be pretty tight-lipped, so...
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and have a good one.